Oh, how are we doing today? So, we turn our attention to the progressives. The progressives were predominantly white, not exclusively white, predominantly white, middle class, not exclusively middle class. There's working class forms of progressivism too, but predominantly white middle class reformers. At the turn of the century, you see the dates that I've given there. We'll see as we go through this lecture that it's hard to talk about a progressivism. It's more like there are progressivisms. The difference between some of these individuals was so great. We'll see that, but nevertheless, there are some certain things I think that bind them together. I'll eventually give you kind of a four principles of progressivism, if you will, that unites a lot of these disparate thinkers. But at this point, it's safe to say the progressives were people who sensed the kind of changes we've been talking about so far, what I've been calling America 2.0. The sense that America was a different place and the world was a different place than it was in, say, before 1865, before the Civil War. And rather than just allow these forces of change to run amok, the progressives were the first generation of Americans who said we need to assume some kind of control over these. We need to make sure that these new forces are serving human interests and the kind of values that we value. And so that is what the progressives are about, trying to manage America 2.0. Progressivism is in many ways a movement that starts at the grassroots, eventually finds its support in the federal government, and then it becomes kind of circular at that point. So we need to see how progressivism is kind of being pioneered at the grassroots level. And one of the first groups of progressives that we see are middle-class women, particularly educated, young college women who have a variety of problems going on. We're going to focus on Jane Addams. Perhaps you've heard of Jane Addams because of her Chicago connections. Addams was born into a privileged family. She was able to go to college, get a degree. But what opportunities were available for her after college? This is what many women faced who, wanted to go to college and get a degree and wanted to make the world a better place. What opportunities for employment or civil service were available for women in the 1870s, 1880s when Addams is looking for a career, and the reality is that there weren't. Nurses, secretaries for the new corporations that are arising. But for the most part, the opportunities for meaningful employment for women are just not there, because the sense still, the Victorian age, is that women's place is not in public life. Women are still barred from voting, at least in federal elections. Some states are starting to change that, but still the belief is that if women begin voting or begin taking an interest in business, they will become what the late 19th century called desexed. Desexed meaning not that women would stop acting like women, but that women would start not just acting like men, women would start physiologically looking like women. It was a weird thing, this desexed argument, but that was the belief, and that was the kind of pressures that people like Addams was under. So Addams went through, as many these younger women did, a series of depressions. Neurasthenia is what it was called, as they struggled with the gap between their aspirations and what society would provide for them in terms of meaningful employment. So Addams spent a lot of time with her mother, kind of running around with her mother around the country, around the world. Addams will find herself in the 1880s in England. She falls in with a group of reformers centered around Toynbee Hall in London. Toynbee Hall was what would eventually be called a settlement house in the United States. That's being pioneered in places like London as young privileged kids like an Addams gave up that privilege, went to and bought this place in one of the poor, rougher sections of London, Toynbee Hall. And these middle-class kids just lived there, trying to help the people in whatever whatever needs they had. And Adams was inspired by this Toynbee Hall model. So she comes back to the United States. And arguably whether this is the first settlement house or not, but it certainly is the most famous. Jane Addams in the south side of Chicago will open Hull House in 1889 with one of her friends, Ellen Gates Starr. And these women will attract other women who, again, educated women who are looking to make a difference. Ultimately, Hull House will be the center for, we have any social work majors in the class. You should know Hull House. Hull House is in many ways where modern social work is kind of beginning, and it's beginning among these women who are just looking for some kind of meaningful employment, some way to make the world a better place. And they're finding it through this kind of do-it-yourself project, the Settlement House Project. By 1900, there would be 100 Settlement House projects spread around America's new cities. Hull House was an effort for these women to just meet the needs of the people in that particular community. Understand Chicago its population is just exploding during these years with new immigration from Europe. Now it's not Northern Europeans. Now it's not the Irish or Scottish or Germans coming into the country. It is Italians. It is Eastern Europeans, Southern and Eastern Europeans coming into the country. It's not Protestants anymore. It's Catholics and Jews coming into the country. And Chicago is one of those places that they're coming because there's abundant employment or their families are already here. And Chicago's population is exploding by the hundreds of thousands during these years. And these working class, poor, and newly immigrant classes, they need all kinds of support, and Addams and Starr are there to try to provide that. Hull House was, I think you'll be reading the Gerstle book about Teddy Roosevelt and 100% Americanism. That's not exactly where Addams and Starr were coming from. It would be too much of a stretch to say that Hull House was a forerunner of present-day multiculturalism, just celebrating ethnic differences, but it was closer to that than, say, a Teddy Roosevelt melting pot kind of ideal. Hull House, it was an agent of Americanization. It was a place that offered civics classes for the new immigrants, taught them English. Right, there was an understanding there that you're going to have to adjust to American culture, which was a English-speaking and Protestant democratic culture. You're going to have to make those kinds of adjustments. So there's some of that Americanization going on at Hull House. On the other hand, Hull House was a place that ethnic celebrations were not celebrated, say throughout the country. Hull House would be a place for kind of ethnic shows and displays, celebrations, holidays. So it was kind of a bridge between Teddy Roosevelt's melting pot 100% Americanism and present-day multiculturalism. Adams' ideal for Hull House was what she called the cosmopolitan neighborhood. That Americans didn't need to go out into all the world, that the world was at this time coming to America, coming to the United States. And rather than see immigrants as threats, rather than trying to melt off all that made them different from, say, the Northern Europeans who had stalked America now for 100 years or so, we needed to find a way to take all the best of our different cultures and exist together in one neighborhood. So Adams' ideal was of a cosmopolitan neighborhood, the idea that not just Chicago's peace, but the country's peace, and eventually the world peace, would be built through the bottom up, through the mixings of cultures, through the reconciling of cultures in neighborhood settings like a Hull House. It's not an accident that Adams went on to be an international peace advocate. She's growing that, or she sees that growing up from the kind of work she's doing in Hull House. Adams goes beyond, though, just kind of the the ethnic aspects of this. She sees Hull House as the beginning of a new kind of democracy in America. That at the time, progressives like Adams, Teddy Roosevelt used this term too, that Americans were building a real democracy. Though we hadn't been, or we become less democratic over the years, and what we needed to build was a real democracy. This is what we'll see by the 1960s. The students of the New Left in the 1960s would call participatory democracy, a democracy of equal participation, a democracy that was defined not just by voting every few years or defined by certain rights that we have, but a democracy that was defined by everybody participating in the government of their communities, of their states, and ultimately of their country. So Adams is the forerunner not just of present-day multiculturalism, but she's also the forerunner of a new model for democracy, the recovery of real or more authentic forms of democracy. If you want to know kind of what she's thinking about, she's talking about Stars Hollow, and she's talking about the Gilmore Girls. She's talking about meetings with Taylor. And if you don't know who the Gilmore Girls are, shame on you. Stop this lecture right now, get on Netflix and start watching some Gilmore Girls. I think in the first episode, you'll even see a town hall meeting in process. That's kind of what Adams wants to recover, and a lot of the progressives want to recover, is kind of a town hall meeting style government in America. One final thing I'll say is the Hull House kind of served a couple of purposes. It's the women who are serving their urban communities, in this case, south side of Chicago, are helping immigrants adjust to the United States while also providing a friendlier place to them than, say, the melting pot ideal. But it's also empowering these women who, again, they've been looking for meaningful labor. They've been looking for a way to make the world a better place, and they're finding it through these grassroots settlement houses. And as these women find each other, they will begin to build upon American feminism from earlier in the 19th century. Particularly, they will build the suffrage movement. The idea that women should, go unthinkable, right? That women should be able to vote in federal elections. That women should be able to vote for presidents of the United States. As these women are going to college, as they want to have more of a public life, as they take on more of a public life in places like settlement houses, pioneering our modern majors of social work, these women want more political voice as well, too. So it's not an accident that Adams and Starr and other settlement house workers become active in the suffrage movement and will lobby people like Teddy Roosevelt and Woodrow Wilson for a federal constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote in federal elections, not just in state elections. So understand that at least progressivism is serving different aims in this case, not just kind of social work, but also feminism, and particularly feminism, particularly in the form of expanding women's rights to vote. Investigative reporters, all of Americans' favorite people, who Teddy Roosevelt would call the muckrakers. There's an image straight out of Pilgrim's Progress. There's a character in that allegory who just spends his life kind of standing in the muck and just raking it, and is like, why are you raking the filth? It's still going to be filth. It's still going to be everywhere. Teddy Roosevelt felt that way about this new generation of investigative journalists, that they reveled in the seedier, darker side of American life. They spent all their time trying to expose American problems. And what about what's good about America? What about having pride in America? The feeling was these reporters were not sufficiently American, at least for people like Teddy Roosevelt. Now, for the reporters themselves, they thought that they were crucial to social reform. Look, people just don't know what problems are going on, particularly with the rise of new corporations in industry and urbanization. There's all kinds of new problems arising, and people don't know those things. So we need somebody to uncover these problems. We need somebody to write about these problems. and that was this new generation of investigative journalists. Like I've already mentioned, maybe Ida Wells, who would be the person who exposed John Rockefeller and some of his practices with the railroads and things that would lead eventually to Rockefeller being prosecuted. I'm getting ahead of myself. She would write on lynching. All kinds of investigative journalist pieces going on, but we'll focus on one, and that's Upton Sinclair's book, The Jungle. Maybe some of you probably have heard of The Jungle. Maybe some of you even maybe read The Jungle in a high school history class or literature class, maybe. The Jungle is Sinclair's 1904 novel about a group of Eastern Europe, about an Eastern European family. Jurgis Rutgers is the husband, and it's their move to Chicago. It's a very good subject because, as I said, hundreds of thousands, even millions of Europeans are coming, and they're settling in places like Chicago. So Sinclair writes this novel, The Jungle, about Jurgis and his family, and it begins really on a high note. Jurgis is marrying his high school sweetheart, and they're going to move and have lots of kids, and it's going to be a great time because they're coming to America, right? The land where if you just work hard, you can make something of yourself. America, the place of upward mobility. It's the global immigrant dream to come to the United States because the lowest can rise to the highest just through hard work. And one of the repeated phrases throughout this novel, at least for the first half of the novel by Jurgis, is "I'll work harder." He and his family come and they settle in Chicago. Jurgis takes a job at Armour Swift, the meat packing industry. As people are moving into cities, increasingly they don't have chickens and cows in their backyard. They're having to purchase their meat from somebody else. And Armour Swift have these large meat packing plants where they are producing a lot of the nation's meat. Jurgis takes a job with Armour Swift, and every time he encounters some kind of hardship, Jurgis is there to say, "Yeah, I'll work harder." So he's on an 8-hour shift and he only gets paid for 2 hours, or he ends up being a minute late, and so he gets a whole hour docked of his pay. So he only comes home on that particular day having made like 30 or 40 cents. It's not going to feed his family. It's not going to pay the rent. Jurgis says, "I'll work harder," right? So I'm gonna go work 10 hours. I'll work 2 jobs, right? And Jurgis just keeps trying to maintain the American dream that if I just work hard enough, I'm gonna catch a break, and I'm going to be able to rise up from this lowly meatpacking position. Well, it just doesn't work out. Jurgis's wife has to go take work. Eventually, she will be sexually abused by her boss. Eventually, she leaves Jurgis. I forget whether she leaves him for that boss. This is the disintegration of Jurgis' story. Sinclair is just merciless in detailing what happens to Jurgis. His children end up having to go to work, and one kid, I think, gets killed in one of the factories. I think another kid that he had to leave at home gets eaten by rats. It's horrible, horrible what happens to Jurgis. Eventually, Jurgis finds himself, his family is just decimated. He's separated from his wife, and he leaves Chicago. He heads out west, just trying to make sense of what went wrong. He eventually finds himself back in Chicago, and he stumbles upon a meeting of socialists. And the last couple chapters of Sinclair's book are more or less a socialist propaganda. It's Jurgis sitting in, listening to these socialist speeches, and Jurgis in the end is converted to socialism, and he thinks that he'll have a life for himself going forward now as a socialist. Now, understand, Jurgis, as that central picture, Sinclair, as that central picture suggests there, wrote this book to highlight the problems of people like Jurgis, to highlight the people of those new ethnic working classes, and to try to convert them to socialism. Sinclair was a socialist. What is a socialist? What's a textbook definition of socialism? Understand, I'm never going to give you that because there's just so many different forms of socialism. What did it mean that Sinclair was a socialist or a member of the Socialist Party? It largely meant he wanted a more worker-friendly America. He wanted, 8-hour days, living wages, better working conditions, protections for workers, things like that. Those are the kind of things that meant socialism in the 1890s. And that's why Sinclair writes this book. But that's not how we are, what we remember the jungle for, is it? Remember for that other picture on the side there. What's going on there? Uh, the jungle was a piece of investigative journalism. Sinclair went and worked in the Armor Swift plants, and he kind of recorded what he was seeing in there, and he included those records in the jungle, and those were the ones that really, frankly, messed readers up. Those are the ones that reportedly sent Teddy Roosevelt running to throw up. What am I talking about? Where are you? Uh-oh. I think I lost it. There you are. Sorry about that, friends. This is one of the experts. There was never the least attention paid to what was cut up for sausage. It would come all the way back from Europe. Old sausage has been rejected, and that was moldy and white. It would be dosed with borax and dumped into the hoppers and made over again for home consumption. There would be meat that had tumbled out on the floor in the dirt and sawdust where the workers had trampled and spit. There would be meat stored in great piles in rooms, and the water from leaky roofs would drip over it, and thousands of rats would race about on it. It was too dark for these storage places to see well, but a man could run his hand over these piles of meat and sweep off handfuls of dried dung of rats. These rats were nuisances, and the packers would put poisoned bread out for them. They would die, and then the rats, bread, and meat would go into the hoppers together. This is no fairy story and no joke. The meat would be shoveled into carts, and the man who did the shoveling would not trouble to lift out a rat, even when he saw one. There were things that went into the sausage in comparison with which a poisoned rat was a tidbit. There was no place for men to wash their hands, blah, blah, blah. People are going along, and maybe they're upset for what had happened to Jurgis and his family, but reading these accounts of what's going into the vats, there's other stories where like people lost a hand or a body part ended up in these machines too, and people are reading this like, I got some Armor Swift meat in my freezer. This is pretty scary stuff. You want to know when you're eating whatever it is that goes into making a hot dog, you want to know that it's whatever goes into making a hot dog. It's not Freddy Four Fingers. Think about it. And so this freaked people out. Roosevelt was so disturbed when he read The Jungle that he called up some friends. He's like, you got to go check and see if this is actually what's going on in Armor Swift. So he sent people in, and they come back and confirm, yeah, what Sinclair wrote. It's true. I mean, Roosevelt hated Sinclair because he's a socialist, but like we got to do something, right? We can't have rats and Freddy Four Fingers ending up in our Armor Swift sausage on our breakfast tables. This freaked a lot of people out. And so on the basis of Sinclair's account, two significant pieces of legislation were passed. The Meat Inspection Act of 1906, giving the federal government the power to police corporations to inspect the meat of places like Armor Swift and make sure that, sausage is sausage, and it's good sausage, and there's good sanitary practices going on there. And then the creation of the FDA, the Pure Food and Drug Act, is created as well because of this investigative journalism. Now, this is how this is supposed to work. There's supposed to be new problems introduced into American life from the changes that are going on with urbanization. More people they're not doing the Cedar Bend thing. right? People are not handling their own chickens that they're going to eat. They're not handling their own cows they're going to eat. Somebody else is doing that for them. Who's to ensure that this Armor Swift meat that you did not process yourself, who's to make sure that it's actually what it is supposed to be, that it's actually a good product? Somebody has to do that supervisory work. And in this case, it's the federal government that's going to be given the power to police these new corporations and really this new America, right? I mean, this whole episode just shows how different America is. Increasingly, we are a place where larger numbers of people are dependent upon smaller numbers of people to produce food for them. And we've only kind of gone more in that direction. And so it's important that the consumers of products of food made by others, that they have, good products. And this is one of the first times you see the government really exerting a regulatory role over these large private corporations we've been talking about. And it was because of Sinclair's work. So this was kind of textbook muckraking, right? An investigative journalist uncovers a problem, he writes it up, the public freaks out, they force government to act. Except, of course, this is not why Sinclair wrote the novel. I mean, he was happy, probably, that, Freddy he wasn't going to be eating Freddy Four Fingers anymore. But that's not why he wrote the novel. He wrote the novel to try to convert Americans to socialism, to aid the building of an independent labor movement. Sinclair famously put it this way: I aimed for the public's heart and hit it in the stomach instead. So one of the most successful texts of muckraking was actually one of the greatest failures of muckraking, too, at the same time. There's some of that meat that Sinclair is talking about. Now it's being inspected. Sociologists. Sociology doesn't begin in the United States, but sociology, that field, is emerging in these years after the Civil War. Sociology needs, society to kind of study. In a localized America, there's not so much to study, but as increasingly new cities are born, existing cities become larger, there is need for people to study them, and that's predominantly the work of sociologists. Sociologists don't exclusively study cities, but that is kind of where they're beginning during these years. They're trying to unpack the processes that are creating these new cities, and trying to identify the problems. Early sociologists were not that different from muckrakers. And I should say a lot of them, this is true of the progressives too, a lot of them are coming from Christian families. And so there's not as much of a independent, objective ethos for sociologists like there would be today or even by the 1920s. But a lot of America's early sociologists were Christian activists too. They're studying cities, they're studying urban problems, they're studying these terrible conditions that the poor, the working class, the new immigrants are finding themselves in, and they're saying, how can we, as a Christian country or as Christians, how can we make a difference? One of those persons was Edward Ross, who would eventually become president of the American Sociological Society. I just want to highlight Ross because of one of his essays that he wrote in 1907, New Varieties of Sin, just to kind of show this kind of melding of Christianity and sociology with an overall demand that Americans engage in reforms to all these forces that are underway: industrialization, urbanization, large corporations. How can we manage this, make sure that the most amount of people are benefiting from these processes? Understanding how Christianity and sociology kind of plays their part. So let's look a little bit at this essay. Ross begins, the sinful heart is ever the same, but sin changes its quality as society develops. Modern sin takes its character from the mutualism of our time. Under our present manner of living, how many of my vital interests I must entrust to others? Think of the Sinclair story. Nowadays, the water main is my well, the trolley carry my carriage, the banker safe my old stocking, the policeman's billy my fist, my own eyes and nose and judgment defer to the inspector of food or drugs or gas or factories or tenements or insurance companies. I rely upon others to look after my drains, invest my savings, nurse my sick, and teach my children. I let the meat trust butcher my pig, the oil trust mold my candles, the sugar trust boil my sorghum, the coal trust chop my wood, the barbed wire company split my rails. But this spread out manner of life lays snares for the weak and opens doors to the wicked. Interdependence puts us, as it were, at one another's mercy, and so ushers in a multitude of new forms of wrongdoing. You can see that Ross is invoking Christian theology, sin, but suggesting that we need to kind of change our understanding of sin based on how society has changed. And the word he uses here is an important word for the progressives, interdependence. I've been talking about America 2.0. I've used the word incorporation in a previous lecture, but the word that progressives like Ross used most of the time was the word interdependence. America's become a place that through increased economic connections, through infrastructure connections like railroads, through urbanization, through industrialization, and so more people working for a single employer, we have become interdependent. You can kind of see what Ross means there, right? I rely upon others to look after my drains, invest my savings, nurse my sick, teach my children. All these things that in a local America were largely done in local settings by people you knew or you did yourself. Increasingly, that's becoming more impersonal, more bureaucratic, more, as you said, spread out. And that condition, the condition of interdependence, makes it possible for, as he says, new forms of wrongdoing and new forms of sin. What Ross is trying to do, and I should say that Ross, like Adams, I'm not sure about Sinclair, they are coming from Christian backgrounds, Christian families, but they themselves would not identify with any Christian group. I don't think that Adams didn't go to church as an adult. I don't think Ross did either. A lot of these progressives grew up in Christian homes. Some of them stayed in Christian circles. They became what were called the social gospelers, or social Christians, but progressives like Ross and Adams, they might be more properly identified as post-Christian, in that they still wanted to draw upon Christian ideas, and in some ways even churches, but not because they necessarily were committed to Christianity itself as much as they saw Christianity useful for helping to build a more ethical, more just society. And that's really Ross's argument here in trying to reappropriate the idea of sin to deal with the new problems of interdependence. Look, when you read through the Bible, sin is largely, now in the Old Testament it's a little different, but when you read through, say, the Sermon on the Mount or Paul, sin is usually seen in interpersonal terms, right? Sin is me punching you in the face, or you stabbing me, that, or me stealing your TV set, right? It's interpersonal in nature. What Ross is saying is we need to socialize our understanding of sin. We need to see the railroad executive who will not pay his workers a fair wage. We need to see that person as respectable as they might be, as church-going as they might be. We need to still see that person as a sinner, as a person who is not doing justice by the people who are dependent upon him. So what do y'all think about that? This is something we could take up in our class time together. Does an employer who does not pay his workers a fair wages, does not provide health insurance, using contemporary terms, health insurance, should that person be called a sinner? Are they sinning? Or is sin just because of the way that Jesus and Paul talked about sin? Is it just sin's just an interpersonal thing, and so it really can't be applied to these group relations. Or is Ross on to something here? We should think of Armour Swift when they allowed rats into their meat. We should think of Armour Swift as sinners who need to repent. A politician who lies. Should that politician be considered a sinner who needs to repent of their lying? All these kind of impersonal things that we want to still, in some ways, use terms like evils. How much of Christian theology, in other words, is relevant for this new interdependent America that Ross is writing about? I think is worthwhile for us to discuss, and so hopefully somebody will bring that up in class. But even if you don't, it's worth for you to consider to what extent is Christian theology, and particularly the ethics of Jesus, how relevant are they for the kind of complex societies that you're born into, I'm born into, that just are around us today? How broadly can we apply concepts like sin and repentance and forgiveness, mercy? How can we translate those into broader? How can we even translate those into economic terms? Are good questions for us. And so we have there's others we could talk about, but there are sociologists, there are settlement house workers, and middle-class women, there are investigative journalists, all these people who are pioneering a progressive reforms at a kind of a grassroots level, and not necessarily calling themselves progressives, but they are tackling this common problem of how does this new America that has sprung up from the new corporations, from the new economy, from the railroads, how do we humanize this America? How do we provide for justice within this new America while still preserving, how does America need to change? Or how do our politics especially need to change? How do we ourselves maybe need to change given the realities of this new America? All these individuals are asking those kinds of questions, and they're asking at a grassroots level. Eventually, you'll start to see politicians at higher levels begin to ask those questions too. One of those, who would be governor of Wisconsin in the 1890s, and then in the 1900s would be a senator from Wisconsin into the U.S. government, Robert La Follette. Robert La Follette, one of the kind of first major political champions of progressivism, coming out of Wisconsin. We don't necessarily think of Wisconsin today as a bastion of progressive thought, but it's a pretty red state. But that was Wisconsin at this time. This was, in fact, many Midwestern and Western states were among the most progressive of the states at this time. Wisconsin, I don't want to say Wisconsin was what was typical of other progressive states. It was actually probably more better for us to discuss as more kind of a more radical example of progressivism. Under La Follette, Wisconsin would push three reforms, both for themselves as well as for the rest of the nation. First, public ownership of corporations. Corporations like the railroads should be under some kind of public control. They should not be left entirely or even at all to private direction. So this is kind of the fulfillment of what we've talked about, people's concerns that the railroads were robber barons, for instance, and private individuals should not have this kind of power over the public. La Follette in Wisconsin by the 1890s agrees. We need to move towards an ideal of public ownership of corporations. These corporations offer public service like the railroads or like an Armour Swift, and so they should be under government control or at least government oversight. And what exactly public ownership of corporations look like is does that mean like a utility company, an energy company, which is managed by the state, or did it mean something like Armour Swift having to submit to outside investigators from the government coming in to investigate them? Public ownership of corporations could mean different things. It could be fairly conservative or fairly radical. Is this socialism? That's something that we'll have to talk about as we go through. It's generally something that in the 20th century would consider to be socialism, right? China today still has, for as much as they've moved towards a free market capitalist economy, they still have SOEs, state-owned enterprises. Government-run companies or government-managed companies is usually seen as a hallmark of capitalism. So this public ownership of corporations offered by these progressives, 100 years before our time, is that socialism? Well, to talk about that, let's not worry about the Wisconsin idea. So through people like La Follette and examples like Wisconsin, other states, other politicians are encouraged to address the kind of problems that are being discovered by your muckrakers, by your sociologists, by women like Jane Addams. And progressivism by 1900 will begin to enter national politics through the lens of, a guy we'll be talking about in the next lecture. But before we get to him, let's talk about the 4 principles of progressivism. And I want to reinforce, there really was no one progressivism. There were progressivisms, right? The difference between a Jane Addams and an Upton Sinclair, between an Upton Sinclair and a Teddy Roosevelt or Robert La Follette, for instance, were quite substantial. In many cases, these individuals, we might want to lump them all as progressives, were in fact at odds with each other, running counter to each other. Nevertheless, I think we can talk in fairly general and broad terms about a progressivism, or at least principles that most of the people that I've called progressives that they kind of ascribe to. And so here's kind of your 4 principles before we move into progressivism at the national level. First is a recognition of interdependence. Again, this is a word you will see again and again in progressive writings between 1890 and 1920. It's a term that, I've called it America 2.0. I've used the word incorporation. This is more the progressives term. When you see it, it's usually in the context of somebody suggesting kind of some new reform or something that we need to be doing differently. And usually the argument for why we need to be doing something differently is, because we're interdependent now. And so a recognition that America rapidly after the Civil War, through the kind of changes we've been talking about, through corporations, through railroads, in infrastructure, through urbanization, through industrialization, through changes in consumerism, all these kinds of things, we have become an interdependent society, and we need to, number 2, we need to make sure that we are trying to understand and manage this society in a way that is best for everybody who lives in it. Progressives embrace an ideal of scientific management. This is especially the case with sociologists. Look, it's possible to understand through your scientific method. It's possible to investigate, to research how interdependence works. And as we understand it, as we kind of lay bare the processes of urbanization or industrialization or consumerism or all these things, as we study these problems scientifically, we gain control over them. The more we know something or know about something, the more control we can exert over it. So an ideal of scientific management that government should, and this kind of feeds into number 3 there, who's going to do this? Who's going to do this managing right? We know it's different people who are going to be doing kind of the investigation and research. In some cases, it's going to be journalists. In other cases, it's going to be social scientists. And sometimes the Wisconsin idea was universities should be centers for studying societies around them and identifying the problems. But then who's going to actually do the managing work of making sure these problems are being settled or resolved? Well, that's where government comes in. Local government, state government, but also federal government too. A lot of people, conservatives especially, look at the progressives as your first generation of big government advocates. The progressives were all socialists. You'll never convince many people on the right in the United States the progressives were anything other than socialists, although sometimes they call them fascists too. And people like La Follette and Jane Addams and Teddy Roosevelt, they wanted big government. You actually read these individuals. It's impossible to read a Jane Addams, but it's really hard to even read a Teddy Roosevelt and say that what they're advocating for was an increase in the size of government. It's more kind of what they wanted government to do. So I think it's more appropriate to talk not in terms of big government, although that certainly will come for different reasons. But what they advocated for was positive government. A government that doesn't just sit back and wait for a great strike of 1877 to arise and then sends in troops to resolve it. But a government that acts based on scientific research, a government that acts positively to produce reforms that would prevent something like a great strike of 1877 from even happening. A positive government or a smart state. Did these progressives, in calling for a more active government, a government that would, say, regulate railroads or some progressives were talking about establishing minimum wage legislation, even national health care policy. Did these progressives not understand how un-American this is? Right? I mean, we fought a revolution in 1776 against centralized government, against monarchy, where these progressives kind of advocating monarchy or tyranny in new forms. This is where we need to understand or kind of balance to progressives' conviction that government needed to do more, that it needed to take a more of a managerial role of society. Balance that with all the progressives wrote about in terms of responsible citizenship. Another common word, there's several key words when you read through the progressives. Interdependence is one of those. In the next lecture, I'll be talking about control. You see the word control as a progressive ideal. But the other word you see a lot is responsibility. And this fell more to how they believe that citizens, you and I, non-governmental actors, needed to change. We needed to stop thinking so much in terms of our rights and think more in terms of our responsibilities to each other. The issue of good government was not just an issue of what government needed to do, but it was also how we ourselves, private citizens, needed to change to act more responsibly, to assume more responsibility for the good of our neighbors. It was very much a golden rule Christian ideal ethos that they were advocating for increased social responsibility. And the thought was, as you and I took on more responsibility for our neighbors and helping them with their problems, government wouldn't have to do that much. If our sense of citizenship changed away from, every couple of years or so I vote and that's all I have to do, and otherwise government should just leave me alone. That's such a negative way of understanding citizenship. Progressives were calling Americans towards a more active, a more Christian, frankly, a more responsible kind of citizenry, where we are engaged daily in the betterment of our societies and the betterment of the people around us, who are our neighbors. The progressives wanted us to be asking that kind of question. And as we did that, as Americans became more active, in human betterment. Government wouldn't have to do that much. That's part of progressivism that is often glossed over, the extent to which progressives were kind of looking to a more Gilmore Girls town hall kind of society where we kind of looked after each other more. There's very much an element of nostalgia in a lot of the progressives, especially in Jane Addams' model, of trying to recreate kind of small town community, neighborhood community within this new America of large cities like Chicago and New York and Detroit. How do we recover some of those old values of neighborliness, those old Christian values of looking out for each other? How do we preserve those? So the progressives, to whatever extent that they were the instigators of socialism or big government in America, they also were people who were calling Americans to take citizenship more seriously. And they did so very much with an eye to the people we call our founding fathers. Founding fathers, again and again and again, encouraged citizens to think not just in terms of their private interests, but in terms of their public interests. That was a key phrase from the Revolutionary era, public interest. How do we look out for the good of the public, not just for the good of ourselves? And progressives, in many ways, didn't see themselves as socialists, looking forward to some kind of socialist utopia. They saw themselves as conservatives, trying to roll the clock back to a time in which Americans were concerned about the public interest and not just what was best for themselves. Who is this guy? We'll talk about him in lecture 2. See you in a few.